Yes, the US government did a thing on Christmas night. And, Christmas, I'm thinking of my favorite song that goes, "Oh, holy night, the stars are brightly shining. It is the night of the US bombing of Muslims in Nigeria." Yeah, that's the goodwill spread by the United States government after the US military launched airstrikes on sites in northwestern Nigeria on Thursday, Christmas night. President Trump said the targets were Islamic State terrorists who, quote, have been targeting and viciously killing primarily innocent civilians. But analysts say that the situation on the ground is far more complicated. The New York Times reports that the Sokoto state, which was hit by more than 12 Tomahawk missiles Christmas night, is populated overwhelmingly by Muslims who bear the brunt of terrorist attacks there, according to analysts and groups that monitor conflict. Bishop Matthew Hassan Kuka, Bishop, which means he's a Christian, of Sokoto, said recently that the area does not have a problem with persecution of Christians, and there is certainly no Christian genocide being committed by Muslims, no matter what y'all's grown up mean girl turned MAGA mascot Nicki Minaj and her tyrant daddy Trump says. Even as the Nigerian authorities have disputed Trump's claim about a Christian genocide, they have also chosen to respond to his threats by cooperating with his administration, which is the problem. With everybody cooperating with this regime now, despite everyone also saying that this regime is violating all kinds of laws and protocols, everybody claims to hate what he says, what he stands for, what he's doing, but everybody's going right along with it or not doing much of anything to challenge much of it. The Nigerian government made it clear today that it was on board with the airstrikes. Yes, and there are ongoing conversations with U.S. authorities about possible further military action. What the strikes immediately achieved is not clear, though reports emerged earlier today that one of the areas that was hit was the outskirts of Jabo, a town in Sokoto, that analysts said was not known to harbor any terrorist or bandit groups. That's their words, not mine. The BBC, I know the New York Times, BBC, these are not entirely trustworthy journalistic outlets, but they do get some things right. The BBC reports that this attack comes weeks after Trump threatened to take action, following months of allegations. Get this, dear listeners, allegations by campaigners and politicians in Washington, not by Nigerians, not by, no, by campaigners and politicians in Washington that said that Islamist militants were systematically targeting Christians in the West African country. But the BBC has found that some of the data being relied on to come to this conclusion are difficult to verify. That's imperialist journalists speak for they're lying, and we know they're lying, but we don't want to get sued for calling them liars because they will sue us. Yeah. In September, popular television host and comedian Bill Maher said on his show that what was happening in Nigeria was a genocide. And he referred to Boko Haram by saying they've killed over 100,000 since 2009. They've burned 18,000 churches. Let me tell y'all that Bill Maher doesn't care about anybody's house of faith being burned down. He does not. If you watch that show, you know how much that man hates all religion. Right? But he has a special hate for Islam. You know he does. Similar figures like Mar have also been gaining traction with these claims on social media. So, yeah, a lot of this is driven among the popular consciousness from the liberal Islamophobe, transphobe, and general bigot Bill Maher and social media stupidity that's propping up this white Christian nationalist lie about crazed jihadist Muslims indiscriminately killing Christians. again, because this is not the first time these people have used this lie to bomb African countries. The government in Abuja, the actual place where this alleged genocide is allegedly happening, has pushed back on these claims, describing them as, quote, a gross misrepresentation of reality, end quote. It did not deny, the government did, that there is deadly violence in the country, but officials said that terrorists attack all who reject their murderous ideology, Muslims, Christians, and those of no faith alike. So where's the outrage when Muslims are murdered by terrorists? Bill Maher got anything to say about that? Nope, he usually doesn't. Other groups monitoring political violence in Nigeria said the number of Christians who have been killed is far lower than people claim, and say most victims of the jihadist groups are, in fact, Muslims. Nigerian security analyst Christian Ani said that while Christians had been attacked as part of a broader strategy of creating terror, it was not possible to justify claims that Christians were deliberately, intentionally, and solely being targeted. And certainly there are no justification for claims of a Christian genocide. And Nigeria is facing various security crises across the country, not just violence by jihadist groups. This is coming from the New York Times now, the New York Times and the BBC. So, and they are saying these other issues have different causes, so they should not be confused. So, why did the Trump regime really bomb Nigeria? Well, Gary Wilson writes in his article called U.S. Christmas Bombing of Nigeria to Reassert Control in West Africa, published today in Struggle for Socialism, says that the bombing represents a renewed intervention by U.S. imperialism aimed at reasserting control over West Africa, using military force to discipline states, secure access to resources, and contain the spread of anti-imperialist independence movements in the Sahel. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country and largest economy, is central to the U.S.'s efforts in these regards. U.S. military operations in Africa are routinely justified as counterterrorism. The author points out in this article. In practice, they function, U.S. military operations function as tools of imperialist domination. Nigeria's armed forces have struggled for years to suppress armed groups in the Northwest and the Northeast. By intervening directly with air power, Washington presents itself as indispensable to Nigeria's internal security. That dependence is then converted into political influence. Military assistance becomes a means of shaping state policy in ways favorable to U.S. power and Western capital. And the location of the strikes is not incidental. It's not a mistake. Sokoto State lies near Nigeria's border with Niger, one of three Sahel countries, along with Mali and Burkina Faso, whose governments have moved to break from decades of U.S. and French military control. These states expelled Western troops, rejected foreign directed counterinsurgency programs, and asserted greater control over their own security and economic decisions. This process is often misdescribed as geopolitical realignment, but what it really is a struggle for national independence against imperialist neo-colonial domination, because these states are supposed to be sovereign, right? Right? Aren't they supposed to have the right to control their own region? Well, according to the West, and particularly the US, no, they're not. That's why. But it's not the only reason why, because from the standpoint of U.S. imperialism, this independence poses a threat, not because of who these governments cooperate with entirely, but because they have challenged the assumed right of Western powers to dictate military and economic policy across the region. The U.S. airstrikes signal an effort to ensure that Nigeria does not follow the same path of the countries in the alliance of the Sahel states. Nigeria has expanded economic cooperation with China and sought development arrangements that reduce reliance on Western lenders and corporations. More importantly, Nigeria's size and regional weight mean that any decisive move toward greater independence would weaken imperialist control against West Africa, U.S. imperialist control across West Africa. Nigeria remains central to imperialist interests because of its resources. In 2023, oil and gas exports generated more than $45 billion in revenue. The United States is Nigeria's largest export market, absorbing over $6 billion in goods annually. This article states that under imperialism, stability means uninterrupted extraction of oil and minerals, secure transport routes, and a political order that protects foreign corporate profits. They don't care what happens to the people in that country that they're stealing those resources from and the poverty they are plunged in. They don't care. Military intervention is justified as preventing chaos, but in reality, it creates and preserves the conditions under which wealth produced in Nigeria is transferred outward to imperialist corporations, financial institutions, and the governments that send them over there to do their bidding. And this pattern is familiar. Across the global south, U.S. military force has repeatedly been used to secure favorable conditions for energy companies, mining firms, banks, while local populations remain impoverished and politically constrained. And this parallels U.S. policy toward Venezuela, where sanctions and threats of force were justified as humanitarian measures while targeting control of oil revenues. And we can also apply this to the U.S. relationship with Haiti for the same reasons. So, how we are all connected because our common enemy has its hand in all our pockets. Y'all don't see that? Like the U.S. imperialist state and its Western allies have all of their hands in all of our pockets all over the world, and we still sitting around talking about this over here in this other country don't have nothing to do with me. Well, the imperialists who are robbing us all absolutely know that it does. Hmm. So then the Trump administration framed the strikes as a defense of Christians against ISIS militants, right? Conditions on the ground, however, tell a different story. Armed groups in northern Nigeria have targeted Muslims and Christians alike. Communities of all faiths have suffered. The violence is driven by poverty, displacement, land conflict, criminal networks, and decades of state failure. Conditions rooted in underdevelopment, shaped by imperialist extraction and political interference. The Christmas Day airstrikes are not an isolated incident. They're part of a broader U.S. effort and a part of a broader Western imperialist effort to halt the erosion of its control over Africa. It is the new scramble for Africa. As more African states seek to reclaim sovereignty after decades of neocolonial domination, imperialism responds not with development or democracy. That's not how imperialism responds. They respond with coercion in the military. Counterterrorism becomes the justification for invasion and occupation. Security cooperation becomes the mechanism. Independence becomes the threat. But I got to ask, where is this outrage when Israel bombs churches? Where is this outrage when Israeli settlers assault, burn the property and farms of, murders the people, and steals the homes of Palestinians? Where was the outrage when the reformed ISIS terrorists that the U.S. installed in Syria after he was used to coup Assad by Biden started slaughtering Christians and other groups in the country after that coup? Where was I'm not suggesting that the US should be bombing any other country to protect Christians when these things are happening to Christians in other countries. I'm just asking if anybody else sees the hypocrisy in this need to bomb Nigeria over a fake Christian genocide. It's not happening. It's not happening, y'all. But say absolutely nothing about the U.S. proxies who really are slaughtering Christians and anybody else they feel like in other places. Yeah, okay. Then there was the pre-Christmas decision by a federal court in this country regarding the National Guard deployed in this city. I know you're wondering, why is she talking about that? Oh, you'll see in a minute. In a statement about how federal courts uphold occupation forces, our comrades in Pan African Community Action make the case for community control in D.C. They say that the partisan battle between the federal and local government on whether to keep National Guard forces in D.C. is a bipartisan legitimization of structural violence against non white working class communities. Because I don't know if you all know, but on December 17th, the District Circuit Court of Appeals ruled unanimously to overturn a decision that would have expelled over 2,000 National Guard troops stationed in D.C. Yes, the decision where a judge told the Trump administration that the National Guard could not be deployed, that they needed to leave. No, a circuit court of appeals said, no, they can stay while we figure out if Trump has overstepped his legal authority. Because, the National Guard's occupation in D.C. began with Trump's executive order in August, but now, because of this Circuit Court of Appeals decision, they will remain in D.C. until the Judiciary Panel determines if the president is, quote, improperly exercising federal control, end quote. But in the meantime, residents are forced to exist under conditions of war. No panel decision will fix elected officials' ability to deploy soldiers to D.C. neighborhoods. The fact that African communities in D.C. and across urban centers of the U.S. are politically, economically, and culturally dominated territories defines them as internal or domestic colonies, just like Nigeria. Nearly 6 months into the occupation, the courts continue to debate legality while residents endure the consequences of domestic colonialism through heightened militarism. The ruling is part of a growing number of legal disputes over National Guard deployments across the country. PACA's statement reads, yet these debates share a dangerous assumption that a military presence in civilian communities is acceptable, and that the only issue is how it is administered. Across party lines, officials argue over procedure while agreeing on occupation. That consensus exposes the real contradiction. True safety and security for our communities is treated as secondary to maintaining control and occupation, just like Nigeria. As political leadership in DC shifts, the public is being misdirected. Instead of addressing the urgent needs of longtime residents, elected officials lean on slogans like law and order, states' rights, and bureaucratic process. The false choice presented, support or oppose presidential intervention, hides the reality that working class African communities are facing a coordinated assault from both local and federal power, just like Nigeria is facing a coordinated assault from their own leadership and U.S. imperialist power. Huh. This statement continues, says in the ongoing war on working class DC mystifies the fundamental threats facing residents, which are a bipartisan collaboration that supports the occupation, access to life affirming resources being attacked at every level of government, domestic militarization, targeting immigrants, youth, and working class Africans as enemy combatants, narrative warfare that decontextualizes the colonial relationship and struggle for power in favor of political theater. Nearly every step of the way, Paca says, local Democratic Party leadership and the federal Trump administration have operated as co conspirators and collaborators rather than stark political opponents. That we can't tell. We can't tell if the Democrats really hate anything this man is doing because what are they actually doing to even express dissent? Hmm. The Democrat led DC City Council supports misguided notions of safety, expanding police power through blockbuster crime bills. The mayor's office approves fiscal budgets that cut Medicaid access, while the Big Beautiful bill purged over 230,000 DC families from SNAP. In what was once a sanctuary city, ICE now terrorizes working class immigrants with expanded intimidation tactics and support from the MPD. And these people actually detained and arrested some neighbors in our church. There's a big apartment complex across the street from our church. They targeted that place and they arrested some of our neighbors. National Guard troops harass African youth at the behest of council led legislation that expands youth curfews. All this while mass media syndications exploit discontent, promoting narratives that aim to justify more repression. Disputes over federal jurisdiction cannot address these ills. These developments have to be understood as modern features of settler colonialism. Paca says in this statement, no matter how the Judiciary Panel rules, the central issue remains. The federal and local government do not answer to the people and refuse to address the root issues facing our community. Safety cannot come from institutions that operate without community governance or accountability. This moment demands a sharpened call for community control. Community control means the collective ability to wield power through informed consent, participatory decision making, and accountability defined by those most affected. Working class African people in DC need institutions that answer only to the people's vision of safety, not to political careers, federal authority, or corporate interests, certainly not them. Any real solutions to concerns over public safety must begin with a community-led democratic process that allows working class African communities to shape and develop institutions that answer directly to the will of the people. All these politicians at every level in both parties and increasingly in some of the so-called left parties invoke the tough on crime narrative to justify oppressing the poor and racialized poor people who get it first and worst. The few times we are asked, and I mean very few times, we are asked what we believe we need to address the issues in our communities, we always, always, always answer with the most obvious things because they're lacking in our communities, fully funded and equal and quality public education, including subsidized pre-K and providing daycare assistance for working parents, affordable and quality housing, jobs with pay sufficient to afford to live on, and decent benefits, healthcare, including real drug treatment programs, aftercare, and comprehensive mental health care and support. We know that poverty and desperation from poverty drives crime. Everybody knows that because nobody's going to starve because stealing food or stealing money to buy food or keep a roof over your head is a crime. If you are hungry and you know that you get locked up for stealing some bread, nobody is going to be, well, it's wrong for me to steal. No, you're going to eat. And I don't blame you. Because why do you have to live in a society where that is a viable choice? That is the only choice you have left. If you provide people their basic human needs, precarity is reduced because poverty is reduced. Desperation over where one will sleep, where one will eat again, or when one will eat again, or which is going to kill one first, the affection, the infection, or the doctor's bill to treat the infection. Those things become less in the list of things that people have to worry about. So crime is drastically reduced. Does this mean that no one will ever, ever, ever commit any crime ever again? Of course not, because humans are still petty, jealous, and sometimes just awful. But we do know that when you eliminate poverty, you drastically reduce crimes associated with poverty. But instead of listening to us, politicians refuse to spend the money to provide what even they know works to reduce crime. They know. They would just rather spend the same amount of money, and actually a lot more money, on more and more militarized police and more surveillance of poor people than to actually do anything to reduce poverty, because crime is the main threat that underlies that justification used to occupy and oppress our communities, not at all unlike Nigeria. Just like terrorism is the main threat used to justify bombing Nigeria. It's all about power, control, and profit. Just remember that everybody who is aligning with the white Christian nationalist agenda is not always right, and none of them are Christians. Not any of them are Christians. I don't care what anybody says. So, it is just about that time for a station break, dear listeners. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but that's great because, ooh, this next part, a lot, just a lot. So, engineer extraordinaire, what is going on and what's on tap for the people today?
Thank you doesn't seem to be adequate. Your support is critical. Thank you, thank you, thank you again. We appreciate you partnering with WPFW and helping to make our end-of-year drive a success. If you would still like to support WPFW, make us stronger, it is never too late. Go to our website at wpfwfm.org. Thank you for considering WPFW in the season of giving. Wishing you and yours joy, love, and peace.
I think the one regret I have, one of the few regrets I have, is that I never learned to hand dance. I know it's never too late, but I love that kind of music, that old R&B soul, stepping kind of music. I love it. Thank you so much for that announcement. And thank you all. Thank you all so much who every time we did a pledge drive in 2025 and I came on this show, or I was on Resistance Radio with John Kane, or on Full Spectrum with Anthony Rogers Wright, every time we came on here and asked y'all to show up and support us, to keep us on the air, you all did it. And thank you so much. So let's get back to this whole Christmas chaos from these white Christian nationalists, because there is also this ongoing saga with the Epstein files. And okay, I honestly have not wanted to talk about this because everybody's talking about it, right? And it's just a real mess, because I am very frustrated with how the whole thing is being presented and talked about. Because seriously, if you're serious about exposing pedophiles and shutting down child sex trafficking in high places, why is it taking you this long to release these come on now. Anyway, the Atlantic reported the day before Christmas that the latest batch of Epstein files includes many new references to Trump, and they claim enough ammunition for Congress to keep pressing. Pressing to do what? I don't know. But I'm just telling you, Sarah Fitzpatrick writes in her article, so this is why Trump didn't want to release the Epstein files. That's the name of her article that was published in The Atlantic. She says that nearly 2 years ago, Donald Trump kicked off the presidential campaign season with the declaration, quote, "I was never on Epstein's plane or at his stupid island," which he posted on Truth Social in January 2024. And he went on to say, "This is what the Democrats do to their Republican opponent, who is leading them by a lot in the polls." But this week, The documents that were released Wednesday by Trump's own Justice Department, including flight logs and emails, well, those documents tell a very different story. Federal prosecutors determined in January 2020 that Trump had been a passenger on the notorious private jet owned by Jeffrey Epstein, who would later be charged with sex trafficking far more often than they had realized. The president's name appears more than 100 times in files released Wednesday as part of the DOJ's alleged compliance, with legislation requiring it to disclose everything it has on the Epstein case. I'm still confused about why a piece of legislation had to be passed to force the Department of Justice to release documents that prove a bunch of people committed crimes involved in a child sex trafficking ring. I understand the material facts of who is running the DOJ and what this country. I get it. I'm just saying, do you not see how ridiculous that is, y'all? That a piece of legislation had to be passed to get the Department of Justice to turn over evidence that they have proving people committed a crime against children. And these are the people who ran a whole campaign and did a whole lot more on this idea that they are the champions of protecting children from the Democrat the child sex predators. But before it was the Democrats, it was the gay child sex predators. And then it was the transgender child sex predators. And then it was the Democrat child sex predators. But it was never the white Christian pastor child sex predators that have been exposed and keep being exposed. That's why there's all this redacting in a lot of these documents, aside from the politicians. But anyway, the Atlantic article says that Trump fought Congress's demand for transparency for months before abruptly pivoting and endorsing the bill once he realized he had lost that battle. Although many different references to Trump are clearly from news reports or from seemingly unverified tips to the FBI, this is what the Atlantic article says. One conclusion from the files is that Trump's relationship with Epstein, a former friend, was of interest to federal law enforcement for years. They knew, they knew, they knew, they knew, they knew. A White House official said that Trump was never contacted by law enforcement regarding his interactions with Epstein during the time period for which Epstein and Maxwell were charged. Now, I don't know if we should ever believe anything any White House official says, and certainly not this White House. But aren't you curious as to why only Prince Andrew in Britain was the only high ranking public official to be outed and punished? I mean, literally punished. He doesn't have a title anymore. He's not a prince anymore because of this, for his involvement in this. And aren't you wondering why you still don't know, really, other than the few handfuls of folks that the powers that be were like, yeah, we can out them because we don't like them anyway. Aren't you wondering why you still don't know who else is in those files after all this time? It's because officials at every level knew and refused to expose these criminals, y'all. We need to come to terms with the fact that it is not just the elected officials we need to hold to account here, but all the people who had access to the documents and knew who was in them, everybody who knew the people who were involved in this mess. Everybody who knew that their friend, their family member, their mentor, whomever, took a ride on Epstein's Lolita Express and did not say a doggone thing to get justice for those girls, children, little girls. Trump has also insisted that he knew nothing of Epstein's criminal activity, though his critics have questioned how that could be true given their close relationship and history of chasing women and children together. Members of Congress from both parties have said they'll continue to probe the issue in the upcoming year. So there's no end in sight to this whole saga. Representatives told the author that their takeaway from reading the files is that top officials in the Trump administration have not been honest about what was in them and that they intend to press Attorney General Pam Bondi and FBI Director Kash Patel for more information. Representatives and staff on the House Oversight Committee said they were drafting subpoenas in response to the documents released Wednesday, seeking more information related to law enforcement's identification of 10 alleged co conspirators shortly after Epstein's arrest in July 2019. The case that prosecutors were building related to those unnamed co conspirators appears to have been substantial. One document released Wednesday is a November 2020 overview presented to the Deputy Attorney General from an acting U.S. attorney titled Anticipated Charges and Investigative Steps. But what, if any, next steps were taken remains a mystery. It's a mystery, y'all. It's a mystery. The rest of that page is redacted. November 2020, y'all. You know, if I were suspected of being involved in a dogfighting ring in my backyard, I would have been arrested, sent before a judge for a bond hearing, and if I could afford bail, I'd be hiding out in my home because my name and face and alleged crimes would have been made public. Ask yourself why these child molesting pigs in these files didn't get any of that treatment that you, me, and our friends and family would get if we shoplifted some baby formula. The files released Wednesday, and Trump's prominence in them appeared to have changed the calculation for senior Democratic Party leaders, the article says, as they prepare for the midterm elections. Party leadership, see, had previously tried to convince their junior members not to focus on the Epstein files. This is the Democratic Party leadership, not Republican Party leadership. Democratic Party leadership was telling their new members, don't focus on the Epstein files. We're going to stay away from that. But this week, Senate Minority Leader, excuse me, Chuck Schumer, said he will push for the Senate to hold the DOJ accountable for not fully complying with the legislation, citing a missed 30-day deadline for all files to be released and excessive redactions in those that have been. Listen here, y'all. If the focus is on the victims and getting justice for them, if the focus is doing what is right and holding the powerful to account because no one is allegedly above the law, that's what they tell us, ain't it? Why were Democrats telling junior members to ignore politicians involved in a massive child sex trafficking ring? We know why Republicans don't want to. We know why Trump doesn't want these documents to be exposed. We know why Republicans are redacting every other page. But Democrats? But now that there are more documents and they see this as ammunition for them to use against Trump politically in the midterms and in the next election, now they're telling their members to play it up. Chuck Schumer said the Department of Justice needs to shed more light on who was on the list, how they were involved, and why they chose not to prosecute. Protecting possible co conspirators is not the transparency the American people and Congress are demanding. Oh, yeah? Then where was all of this outrage during the last administration? 2020. That email with the possible charges and investigative next steps, 2020. The Justice Department has acknowledged there are still many files to be released, and the known backlog grew longer Wednesday when the DOJ announced that the FBI and New York prosecutors had uncovered over 1 million more documents related to the Jeffrey Epstein case, and that the process of reviewing them could take a few more weeks. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche had earlier said on Meet the Press, excuse me, that the delay was due to the need for additional redactions in order to protect the victims. So you mean to tell me one page that is completely redacted from top to bottom is just a page full of the victims' names? That's what you're doing? You're just redacting out the names of the victims to protect them? And the entire page is, yeah, okay, that's a lie too. And you know that's a lie. Behind the scenes, his office has requested additional emergency help from U.S. attorneys' offices to continue reviewing and redacting Epstein related material over the Christmas and New Year holidays, CNN reported. Just release them. Just release the documents. Did y'all not learn from WikiLeaks how to do that effectively? Just put it out there to the people. Good grief. But the DOJ's Public Affairs Office, excuse me, has sought to downplay mentions of Trump in the file, saying that Wednesday's documents, quote, contain untrue and sensationalist claims made against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. To be clear, the claims are unfounded and false, and if they had a shred of credibility, they would have been weaponized against President Trump already, end quote. Why in the world is the Democratic Party still calling on the Department of Justice, reshaped by Trump loyalists, to do anything other than protect the man who put them in charge of reshaping the Department of Justice? What are you demanding that these people who are Trump loyalists do to bring their Fuhrer down? What is wrong with these people? Sigrid McCauley, an attorney who represents several of Epstein's victims, said it would take time to know the true impact of the avalanche of new documents released Wednesday. But she told the author of this article one thing that she said is clear. She said, quote, these brave survivors were absolutely correct that the government was withholding critical information from the public, end quote, because that's what this government does. What we're seeing this government do with the Epstein files is exactly what this government does with every single horrific, evil, immoral, violent, murderous, genocidal, imperialist thing. Every single thing. This is why you don't know how many coups the US has actually fomented around the world. This is why you don't know anything about US imperialism in the global south. This is why you don't know about Operation Condor, because the government has been lying to this country the entire time. The whole time the government was withholding this information from the public before this regime took over the DOJ. From the very beginning of this scandal, from the very first time the public heard of Jeffrey Epstein, his island, the plane rides, the young girls being abused, government officials knew everything. And even before we knew, they knew, because they were doing it. And the ones who weren't doing it and knew those who were, they kept quiet about it all for obvious reasons. They know everyone named in those files. And they know they will eventually have to answer for why they did nothing. They didn't do anything about what they knew long before now. Governments probably will collapse if the names of every visitor and friend of Epstein were released. Excuse me, institutions probably would be impacted. We'd find out that we are all closer to pedophiles than we realized. And they aren't immigrants trafficking children at the border, nor are they operating child sex torture dungeons under pizza parlors in Virginia. No, they're the presidents of colleges. They're CEOs of major corporations. They're religious leaders. Oh, I know it's a bunch of religious leaders in there. And of course, politicians, lots and lots and lots and lots of politicians. The powerful will always protect each other, regardless of what they do to us with that power and to amass more of it. They will always explain away any degradation done to the people who are in the way of their pursuit of power and profit. That all of this is going on during the season that's allegedly focused on the birth of the Prince of Peace. The one who is alleged to have come to bring peace on earth and goodwill toward men, and that the people carrying all of this out are allegedly his followers? That's crazy. Since what this is not why Christ was born, and these people are not his followers. Now, listen, whatever you believe or not, Christ was born in Palestine, occupied by Rome, to parents who had to immigrate to escape a psychotic king and were given sanctuary in another city. Christ's example was to show the oppressed how not only to survive by taking care of each other under oppression, but how to challenge oppression and the oppressors, because all humanity is equal and God hates oppression. In a nutshell, anyway. That's how I summarize the whole Bible narrative. And yes, the fact that Jesus is Palestinian absolutely matters. And the fact that Christians today of all denominations ignore that also matters. Because that's why we're seeing what we see today. Mitri Raheb, a Palestinian Christian who is the pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem, which is in Palestine, says in his book, Faith in the Face of Empire, the Bible through Palestinian eyes, quote, it is enervating to feel that one's country and people are occupied not by an equal, but by an empire, albeit a proxy. But this is the context in which the people of Palestine have repeatedly found themselves. This is the context in which the Bible was written, and it is the context Palestinians face today. In this important text, and it's a very small, very short book, less than 150 pages, I think, Raheb reminds readers that the Bible is a story about Palestine, the people, its history, and the land. And that word, land, is something he highlights in explaining the impact of the influence of the occupiers and colonizers on that story about those people. He points out that the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount are parts of Psalm 37, and one of those verses that we recite faithfully contains a misinterpretation that lays the claims about God giving that land to European Jews absolutely to waste. Because, see, when Jesus says in the Beatitudes, in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, as is recorded in Matthew 5:5, Rahab explains that the original text in Psalm 37 that Jesus is citing talks about the land, not the earth. And that meaning for that one word that was changed when the scriptures were translated from Jesus's language, Aramaic, to Greek is earth shattering. Rahab notes that changing that word might make sense for Romans who had a vast empire, and the idea of the land didn't mean the same thing to them as it meant to the people that Jesus came from, whose land was being occupied by Rome, and then many other empires, well, before and after Rome. Rome believed they had conquered the earth, so changing that one word made sense for them. But for Jesus's people, the land meant Palestine. And the original meaning of that word transforms a confusing and sometimes illogical scripture into a powerful promise to oppressed people. In the context of the repeatedly occupied people of Palestine, Jesus delivers a message that embodies the endurance of the people in that mistranslated scripture. When he says that the meek will inherit the land, he is talking about the inevitable passing of the empires that occupy the land and who is left when they do. It's not the strong and the brave or immorally violent, the soldiers that either invaded or tried to defend from invasion. It's not the highest educated or the professional class who usually leave the occupied land if they can for a better life, which ironically usually ends up being in the heart of the empire. It's certainly not the politicians who would have already escaped the collapse of the occupation, and pursued that the greed and the exploitation of the occupiers made possible, and that the politicians kind of helped prop up. No, instead, Jesus was conveying an incredible fact about the cycle of empire and occupation, the part that no one pays attention to, that he, being born into a people occupied by Rome as just the latest in a long line of occupiers, and that he also knew would not be the last, understood clearly. And that is that all empires fall. The length of occupation does not signal its permanence. All empires eventually do fall. The question is what's left when they do? Or in the case of the answer Jesus gave in Matthew 5:5, who is left in the land after the empire is gone? The meek. That's who. The people who were not the soldiers, not the academics who could leave, not the politicians. It's the people who tried to keep their heads down and avoid the scrutiny, degradation, and violence of the colonizer state. It's the people who have long since given up any hope of any type of justice or even fairness and human dignity within the system of occupation as it exists. It's the people who fight actively against that system of occupation to destroy it, to protect those other people, even at the expense of their own safety and lives. It's those people who may retreat into their traditions and religions for solace, into their work for purpose and cover, or into the struggle against occupation because it is the last hope that they have, or who just try to be as unobtrusive, invisible, and unnoticed as possible so they can just survive another day in the empire and not be an open target of oppression. The meek. When the empire falls and the occupiers leave, it's the meek who will be left to inherit the land. Jesus was spitting facts sharper than a two-edged sword, and I am unconcerned about whether you believe in Jesus or the Bible or religion or not, because Jesus, through this text, was making a political statement. And we should not make the mistake of letting our bias against religion miss the politics that are being conveyed here. Many of us Christians missed this. And I'll admit that I certainly did, because my understanding of meek and that scripture comes from the colonizers of this land and that faith. And because the change in that one word from land to earth has done more to erase Palestine from even our understanding of the scripture, the entire Bible narrative, and our faith. Because if the original word land had been left in the scriptures that we read today, wouldn't we have asked a long time ago, what land are they talking about? And come to the obvious conclusion that Jesus was talking about Palestine. The new covenant between God and humanity that Jesus represents in the New Testament is Jesus's answer to the imperialist oppression and exploitation of his time and of all time to come. His answer to occupation and the ways that empire divides people to conquer them and control the land was for people to reject that division and unite. This is why the Gospels lift up the unity of God's people in Christ rather than maintaining religious, social, or even political divisions through scriptures. This idea of one people under a new covenant that does away with arbitrary and often empire imposed and definitely empire serving divisions, that's the whole point of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are one, and that is how we survive and will outlive, if not outright defeat, every empire. Unity through the deeply political and politically manipulated translations of the original text that Europeans produced. They not only shifted the focus of the scriptures from the people of the Levant that the text is about and their history and their political reality, but it also ensured that their translations, the European translations, gave moral and political cover for their global expansion through colonialism and missionaries, which is just spiritual colonialism, and eventually bloody military invasion and conquest. There is not a damn thing Christian about the oppressors erasing the people who wrote the Bible, the land that belongs to those people, and the citizenship of the Messiah that is probably just as, if not more, important than his resurrection, whether you believe it or not. That Jesus is Palestinian, who said the meek shall inherit the land, has always been the answer to the question of Palestine. And the conflict could have been derailed decades ago if white Christians had not already decided that they hated non white people more than they cared about the faith, the true religion, pure and undefiled, which they do not follow and do not believe in, regardless of what they say. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That's not what white Christian nationalists want. They don't worship or pay any attention to Jesus Christ and his message of peace, love, equality, unity, justice for all. Instead, they worship their God of power, money, and global domination. Peace on earth and goodwill towards men, that gets in their way of their ungodly pursuit of pan European settler colonial global domination. That's the chaos they unleashed upon the world this Christmas, and it's the chaos they will unleash upon the world until white Christian nationalism is crushed right along with imperialism and its baby brother, Zionism.